My research is focused on using statistical and data-driven approaches to explore and utilize complex clinical data from intensive care. My work currently lies at the intersection of these two seemingly distinct topics, and I hope that giving a brief introduction to both helps motivate it. Before discussing machine learning, it's useful to consider how we as humans learn, from when we are very young and first experiencing the world, all the way through to when we're super old maths PhD students and beyond, and compare and contrast this experience to machine learning. Large complex datasets that make classical methods impractical require new approaches. The basic idea of machine learning is this paradigm shift in which we no longer ask the computer to perform explicitly programmed computations, but to find rules or associations between data and answers by exposure to huge quantities of examples. What does this actually mean, though? A typical machine learning task is classification of data into a number of categories. We want the algorithm to learn a decision boundary that partitions the input space according to these categories. One of the biggest successes of machine learning in recent decades has been deep learning. A deep neural network is a stacked graph of units that are arranged in layers. These units are capable of learning different representations of the data in a hierarchy where these representations become increasingly more global and abstract the more layers are included. Two examples briefly. Neural style transfer seeks to combine the content of a base image with the style of a reference dataset using global abstract features from deep learning. In this case, it makes the Center for Mathematical Sciences look a bit more Picasso. Deep Dream maximizes the activation of specific units from a pre-trained deep neural network that correspond to features of the training data, and triply tries to find these features in your image where they don't exist. These ideas may seem weird and abstract, but they're already a feature of many smartphone apps and Instagram filters. Machine learning is often superhuman at perceptual tasks, but not at all capable of conceptual understanding or logical reasoning. One aspect of that is that these algorithms often fail to correctly identify objects that have been artificially rotated or distorted, even though they may recognize the original image, something humans can do remarkably well. It's important to go into a machine learning project aware of the limitations of the methods as well as their potential, and an understanding of how this may impact your conclusions, rather than just throwing data at the problem and hoping for the best. Generative models allow us to understand the generative process behind some dataset and to build abstractions beyond that. A latent variable model jointly describes the data and unobserved underlying features, increasing the expressive power of the model. Inference about the latent variables allows us to learn novel features important in the data generating process. This is the form of unsupervised representation learning using deep neural networks. We implicitly regularize these representations. By forcing them to be useful for data generation, we are also ensuring that they encode meaningful information about the data. So I'm going to pivot now and talk briefly about intensive care. A primary cause of admission to the ICU is traumatic brain injury, which is a leading global cause of disability and mortality. Care of critically ill patients is highly reliant on data-driven multimodality monitoring, particularly as they are often unable to communicate. Patients may experience rapid clinical deterioration over minutes or even seconds, so we need a concise and online characterization of the patient state in order to guide intervention and treatment. Multimodality monitoring is an umbrella for a wide range of techniques for monitoring and analysis of the physiological and biochemical responses to acute injury. In practice, much of the information from routine monitoring is discarded, for example, in averaging signals or retaining only pulse rates or amplitudes, in order that clinicians are able to quickly absorb and interpret a patient's clinical trajectory. To make this more concrete, here's an example of an important biological mechanism called cerebral autoregulation. The brain is quite demanding, requiring sufficient oxygen for its constantly high metabolic demand, and so is very sensitive to under or over perfusion. Broadly, autoregulation refers to cerebrovascular responses against changes in CPP in order to ensure stable cerebral blood flow. This means the blood vessels in the brain are constantly modulating diameter and smooth muscular tone. Underlying this is a lot of fairly complicated biology. Traumatic brain injury can impair autoregulation, which in turn leaves a patient vulnerable to ischemia, which is bad, or hyperperfusion, which is also bad. Treatment aimed at maintaining an optimal range of CPP values specific to an individual can help minimize the risk of autoregulation failure. How does this fit in with our machine learning using intensive care data? Impaired autoregulation is closely related to the worst outcomes. Algorithms for learning novel representations allow us to interrogate complex independencies within the data and identify other features that are important when autoregulation is impaired. We're interested in using deep learning to describe clinical data and the underlying physiological processes. The richness of multimodality monitoring makes it particularly amenable to machine learning approaches. Disentangling style from content in clinical applications is analogous to the goal of identifying personalized therapeutic targets.